Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I realize the sacrifice you're making coming here instead of waiting in line for lunch. So I appreciate it. Somehow I have the luck of always going right before lunch. So I'll try not to keep you too long and hopefully keep you entertained in the meanwhile. So, as mentioned, I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about RubyMotion. As was mentioned, just some contact info for me here. I do live in Bodrum, Turkey. That's a picture of the castle that we get to see. So, and that in the background in the mist is Greece. So it's a nice place. You might have noticed I don't necessarily have a Turkish accent, and that's because I am actually not Turkish. My wife is, and that's how we ended up there. People sometimes ask, So, and currently, I work for Balanco Software. We are the commercial arm of the open microscopy environment, which builds tools, libraries, and a platform for scientists to manage and organize microscope data. But I'm not going to talk about microscopes today. Instead, I'm going to talk about RubyMotion. So what is RubyMotion? Well, to put it quite simply, RubyMotion is a dialect of the Ruby language implemented on the Objective-C runtime. So it's not 100% compatible with any version of Ruby. It's closest to Ruby 193.20-ish. And there are certain reasons, there are certain limitations of the iOS devices that make it impossible to be 100% compliant. So it tries to be as compatible as possible. And using the Objective-C runtime, what does that mean? Well, to help you understand how RubyMotion relates to Objective-C and iOS and what the heck is this thing called the Objective-C runtime, let's consider some Objective-C code. So if you're not familiar, this is a simple class declaration in Objective-C with two member variables, ivars, right? And you might assume that when you write this code, it runs on the device. Simple, right? But not quite. It's not quite that simple. Because what happens when you compile an Objective-C project is that the compiler turns Objective-C into C function calls. And the Objective-C runtime is this collection of function calls that are used to do everything that you expect Objective-C to do. Right? So this is just a small sample, right? So you've defined a class with some ivars, very simple, but the compiler actually has to turn this into a call to this C function, allocate class pair, and then register class pair, and then add ivar and add ivar. When you start calling methods, there's obviously message send and all sorts of different C functions, right? But what's really nice about Objective-C is that these C functions are available in a library for anybody. So we can just simply say, well, if you're going to define a Ruby class and add instance variables to the Ruby class, we'll just call the same C functions. And that's exactly what RubyMotion does. So people sometimes are a little confused by RubyMotion because before RubyMotion, there were a lot of other compatibility libraries or frameworks or, PhoneGap and Sencha Touch, and they've all changed their names for some reason, so I don't think those are the current names. And a lot of times what they were doing is working with JavaScript a lot of the time, but actually having JavaScript call functions on some other objects that then call other functions that go through to the runtime, right? So you have this layer sitting between your code and what the machine is actually going to execute. In RubyMotion, that's eliminated by directly emitting the C function calls from the Ruby. And one of the reasons that we can do this is because Ruby and Objective-C are actually very similar. They both take a lot of influence from Smalltalk, and their object model is very compatible. They're both dynamic, right? It's a little hard to reconcile the notion of Objective-C being a dynamic language because you still have to put type signatures everywhere, but it turns out that those don't really mean all that much. So this is how RubyMotion works. Now, you might be wondering, okay, neat. It's a neat trick. Why do I care, right? Because Objective-C is the supported platform, right? It's what Apple wants you to use. And, why would I use something else if it's just going to give me an equivalent compiled app, right? It's not necessarily better. Actually is in a couple of cases, but... So to try and convince you why you might care about RubyMotion, let's take a very simple application. And this used to be a lot more impressive before iOS 7, because it's actually a label with a button, and used to actually have the button, and you could see, now it just looks like somebody threw some text up there. So this is a simple timer app. We've got a label that's going to display the seconds elapsed, and we've got a little button that we can start. The timer starts counting up. We can stop, right? And we hit start again. It goes back to 0 and starts again. Very, very simple, right? Okay, let's build this with Objective-C. All right, so fire up Xcode, open a new project. We probably, it's not an OpenGL game. Let's go with empty application, right? I mean, nothing else really kind of fits. This is simple, right? So we have to give it a name and decide whether or not we want to use core data. Then there's this window that pops up to greet you to your project with a form. And then, we don't actually have a class yet, so we've got to go back to new class, or we don't even have a view. I'm sorry, we don't have anything to work with. So let's add a view, right? And I don't know, choose view, right? And then that gets us something like this. So we can, we're getting somewhere. We can pull in a label, we can pull in a button, and then we try and hook it up and realize we don't have anything to hook it up to. So then we got to go back to the new file dialog, and we've got to pick a Objective-C class, not a protocol or extension, or and then we've got to put that in, give it an action, hook it up, and then add an ivar, and yeah. And now you can start programming, right? That was just wiring things up. Now, yes, I realize that this is a bit of a contrived example. There aren't that many timer apps in the iOS App Store. And for larger applications, you do this once at the start, and then you just kind of go from there. So, what does the equivalent look like with RubyMotion? Well, RubyMotion is built on a more Unixy philosophy, right? Everything from the command line. So hopefully you are okay with the command line, because you're going to start your project by running a command, motion create, in the name of your application. Done. Okay, we've got a couple of files, right? So pretty simple file tree. We can add a file timer controller so that we can create a controller class, right? We open up the app delegate, and we tell the app delegate to create a window to set that Windows root view controller to this controller class that we're going to write in a second, right? Set it as a full screen layout, and then tell it to go, right? That make key invisible is kind of run, right? So then the timer controller is a subclass of UI view controller, and part of the Objective-C API is that these view controllers have this method that gets called viewDidLoad. Gets called when the view is loaded, as the name suggests. And this is where we get to do some setup, right? So we can create a new UI label. We can set the font and the text and alignment and color, and then position it, right, with the frame. And we add it to our parent view. And then the same thing with a button. And the button at the very bottom there, we say add target so that when it's tapped, right, this UI control event touch up inside. Objective-C loves these really long names. We're going to call a method action tapped. Define the method. It's pretty simple. If there's a running timer, stop it. If there is no running timer, create it. And the timer is just this NSTimer class that will fire every 10th of a second and call this timer fired method. And then the timer fired method just updates the label and increments the time by 0.01 or 0.1, right? Nice and simple. Go back to the command line, run rake. There's your app. That's it. So the idea with RubyMotion is a difference of philosophy, really, from Objective-C. And it's not so much a question of right or wrong or better or worse, but Objective-C and Cocoa and Xcode are sort of firmly in the camp of IDE with, lots of tooling and, pulling things around with the mouse and, visual design. RubyMotion is more to the other end of the spectrum, where everything is a plain text file. All of the commands are on the command line. The build process is very straightforward and simple. So, it's an alternative. It's out there. But again, we just have the same set of classes that we had before, right? So we haven't really gained anything over Objective-C. The code that I just showed you looked a lot like Objective-C, but written in Ruby, right? Dots instead of brackets, but all the same APIs. So again, maybe you like the command line enough that this is enough to convince you, but does it get any better? Well, it does, actually. Because you see, we can add things to RubyMotion. We can add libraries. And Ruby, being Ruby, is a flexible language, much more so than Objective-C. You see, Objective-C is built as a strict superset of C, right? You may have heard that phrase used before. What does it mean? It means that any piece of C code must be valid Objective-C code. So you cannot alter the Objective-C language in such a way that C code wouldn't compile, right? You're handcuffed to C. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it does mean that you can't do certain things with syntax and certain conveniences that Ruby just, doesn't think twice about. So let's rewrite our timer controller, this time taking advantage of a couple of libraries. So it'd be really nice if I could sort of separate my layout in code from everything that's going on. So let's do that. We've got a method now called layout that we call on the view at the start of our viewDidLoad. And we tell it to add two subviews. One is a UI label, and one is a button with this UI button type rounded rect. That's it. Good. Give them labels, time and start. You'll see why those are important in a second. Okay, then let's set up some behaviors. The button is going to change its label depending on whether or not the timer is running or not. So we give it two titles for different control states. And then that button, when it's tapped, on tap, there's our timer logic, right? If the timer is running, stop it and clear it out. If not, set it to 0. And now instead of that NSTimer, invoke method and creating another method, we have this nice convenience where we can just say every 100 milliseconds, do this little thing. Update the label text, add 0.1 to the timer. Done. Right? The time and the start, why are those labels up there? Well, because now we're going to create a style sheet. Right? We've separated presentation logic from the rest of our code. So we can create this style with some dimensions to set our top and left margins. And then we can create specific styles for the time label and the start button, setting the font, setting the text, the colors, the exact position in the view, right? And these will get applied to each of these UI elements within that layout method in viewDidLoad. So when all of this is done, we end up with the same exact application. But now we've sort of restructured the code. It's a little bit easier to reason about. So now hopefully you're getting a feel for why it might be better to go with RubyMotion. Maybe. How is this possible? Well, what I didn't show you is in that RubyMotion project, there's a rake file. And in the rake file, I added 2 lines, requires, for gems that I installed, the teacup gem and the sugar cube gem. You see, the RubyMotion community has been going nuts with gems. It's really fun to watch, right? And so these are 2 of the earliest gems that were created. Teacup is the one that lets me do those layouts. So it's the one that allows you to create the style sheet, use the layout command to set the layout, the subviews to set the subviews, instead of that verbose UI kit code that you're usually having to do. And sugar cube, as the name implies, is just a lot of these sugar methods, so that 100 milliseconds every to generate a timer that fires every 100 milliseconds, that's sugar cube, right? I could have actually gone even further. SugarCube has methods to generate UI colors from text and set font sizes and all kinds of fun conveniences that Rubyists would just sort of take for granted, right? But in Objective-C, it's essentially unheard of. And so this is where I tell you that this is not actually a technical talk. I fooled you, right? That's the end of the code. I don't want to talk about code anymore. Because as fun as the code is, and as nice as it is, I think what really sets RubyMotion apart is what I just showed you, those libraries that were created. And not just the libraries, but the people behind those libraries. As it so happens, the person behind those 2 libraries, it's the same person behind both Teacup and SugarCube, and his name is Colin. And shortly after RubyMotion was released and the mailing list started, Colin started sending messages saying, how would I do this, how would I do that? Right? Had all of these ideas on how to bring Rubyisms into RubyMotion to make iOS development easier. And it was fun. We had a lot of back and forth conversation on the mailing list, and he started taking all of these methods that he was generating and putting them together in a library. And originally, there wasn't a good way in RubyMotion to include outside code, right, other than copy-paste. So he figured out, along with a couple of other community members, how RubyMotion could actually use Ruby gems. It's a little complicated, but it works. And he went at this for a while until he got hired by HipByte, the company that makes RubyMotion. And so now he's the community manager for RubyMotion, right? So what is RubyMotion? Well, more than just a programming language, I really think of RubyMotion as a community of hackers, tinkerers, students, and even professionals. There are people making money doing RubyMotion. You can, too, have a job doing RubyMotion. But we're all having fun, right? Something that I think all too often gets overlooked in the programming world, right? We focus so much on the best way or the fastest way or the most efficient way. And sometimes we find ourselves, sitting at our desks or standing at our desks or what have you. And we're grinding out code and we're hating it, right? How did that happen? You should be able to have fun at the same time as you get everything done. And I think that the RubyMotion community has, so far, managed to preserve that sense of fun. So I want to share with you a sampling of what's out there in the community. As I mentioned, Colin created those first two libraries and originally just put them up on GitHub. And then once we figured out how to distribute them as gems, put them up on the RubyGems site. But there was a concern that Ruby is, the bigger Ruby community is very big, and there are a lot of gems, and only a subset of those gems were specific to RubyMotion. And because of the way that RubyMotion is this dialect instead of a actual equivalent, feature-for-feature equivalent of Ruby, there was a concern that these gems would get lost in the mix, right? So the community, again, put together this website, RubyMotion Wrappers. And originally there were, I think, 6. And now there's, this is just the tags. I wanted to get like the first line of the listing of wrappers, but I couldn't fit it on the slide because just the tags alone fill up the page. So, there are things like ProMotion, which tries to take the Rails development philosophy and apply it to RubyMotion apps. There is RubyMotion Query. I don't think it has a tag yet, but RMQ, which actually takes jQuery and the notion of selectors to be able to manipulate view elements, right? So where Teacup has this notion of styles that you can apply, RubyMotion Query actually lets you manipulate not just styles, but positions and actions and gestures and all the rest. We also have an IRC channel. You'll find me there most days. Sometimes I'm busy and don't necessarily get to reply immediately. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's very active. But usually if you pop in there, ask your question, you might get a response. If you don't, we also have a mailing list. It's fairly active and fairly well monitored by the guys at HipByte. The IRC channel especially lights up once a month during the Motion Meetup. So this is not even something that HipByte created. This is just members from the community decided that we should have a virtual meetup once a month to talk about RubyMotion. So it's done as a Google Hangout, and anybody can sign up to join. The back chat is in IRC, and we, usually there's a guest that gets invited, and it's a bit of an interview in QA, and then they take questions from the IRC room. It's a lot of fun. They're all recorded as well, by the way, so if you go to that website, you can see all of the back episodes. We have a newsletter now, right? This is a relatively new. The RubyMotion Dispatch. And just recently, again, this was something created by the community, and the guy that created it was contacted by the folks at HipByte, the company behind RubyMotion, and they said, "You're doing such a good job with this. Would you mind being our official newsletter, right? When we need to do announcements and whatnot, can we just point people at your newsletter?" So it is now the official RubyMotion newsletter. Another developer started creating screencasts, Motion in Motion screencasts. And you can subscribe, and I think it's weekly, yeah. he puts out a new episode covering a lot of the different wrappers and technologies that the community's come up with. And recently, a couple of the people involved with Motion in Motion and a couple other members from the community set up this group on GitHub, RubyComotion. It's great. And it's all about just coming together and hacking on RubyMotion, right? And the first project they did was they took this UIKit Elements sample app, right? So this is an Objective-C sample app that basically you run it on your phone and it's like every possible UI element, buttons and sliders and progress bars. And they converted it all over to RubyMotion, right? So now there's this fairly sizable app in RubyMotion that you can use as a reference if you need to. Right? And when they announced that they had done this, I said, this is so cool. Would you guys mind if I mention this during this talk that I'm going to give, right? And so the guy that leads the group, Dennis Major, actually emailed me back and he said, sure. And why don't you tell people? He says, during our first IRC orientation get-together, when I noted that I knew next to nothing about Git and GitHub, the group made me their GitHub canonical repo integration manager, right? They put him in charge of GitHub. He didn't know anything about GitHub. And he thought, are you guys crazy? But the group is actually being really successful. They've gotten a lot done, and they're all sort of learning together as they go. So what is it that makes RubyMotion different, right? What is it that allows RubyMotion to preserve that sense of fun? Well, if you've been around Ruby as a language, you may have heard this term Swan, right? It's an acronym for Mats is nice, so we are nice. Mats is the creator of the Ruby language, and I'm horribly mispronouncing his name. Apologies. But if you've ever met him in person, he is an exceedingly nice guy. And so, we try and hope that some of that rubs off on the community. And even more so, when Mats has talked about why he made Ruby, he explicitly states, as a couple of times, that he optimized Ruby for maximum developer happiness, right? Performance and speed and parallelizability and robustness and fault tolerance, these are all things that you could be concerned with, right? And sometimes you need to be concerned with. But if you take a look at all of the programming that you do, how many times do you really need 5 nines of uptime, right? Probably for like that central core thing. But a lot of times, you just need to be able to get something done, right? Do it quickly, get an idea out on paper, as they say, right? And Ruby is really optimized for that step of the process. The other thing that makes RubyMotion a little different is RubyMotion's history goes back to MacRuby, which was a project that Laurent started at Apple. And I was at Apple at the same time. But even though we were both in Cupertino, we were in separate buildings. So we didn't see each other most days. And he had prior connections with the open source community, so he reached out to some friends from the open source community to help him out with this project. So by the time I joined the project, he already had a developer in Tokyo, a developer in Amsterdam, the two of us in Cupertino, a guy in Paris. So from the very beginning, we were distributed all over, and we had to rely on email and chat to communicate. In fact, I didn't meet one of the developers that I knew so well that I consider him a close friend. I only met him for the first time like 5 years later. And in retrospect, we did this because of necessity. Apple wasn't going to necessarily hire all these people, but one person alone wasn't going to be able to do this on his own. We wanted it to be open source, so we wanted to be able to have contributions from the community. So we didn't really even think twice about making this a distributed project. But it turned out that this made it very easy for new people to join the project. About a year after MacRuby was released, this fellow from Japan just started sending pull requests, right? We didn't know who he was. He called himself Watson. It's not his real name. But Watson was employee number 2 at HipByte, because just sending pull requests and conversing with us on chat and email, he just melded in with the community, right? And it wasn't really even a second thought. And what we found is that by being so accepting of anybody who wanted to come and submit a patch or ask a question, without even trying, we ended up with a really, really diverse community. Our first conference was this amazing display of programming community diversity. The other thing that I think helped RubyMotion to maintain this sense of fun is that we're always the underdogs, right? At Apple, we were always sort of fighting against Objective-C, and after Apple, there was still a fight against Objective-C. You know, and people have said some really nasty things about RubyMotion. You know, but I'm reminded of the famous quote, you know, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And I realized that one of the things that we sort of inadvertently did at RubyMotion is whenever people would attack RubyMotion, we'd just go and build something, right? There were a number of times that, and different members of the community have had to hold other members back, right? People have had to hold me back, I've had to hold other people back. You know, somebody says something really nasty and you just want to go out there and you want to say, no, you're wrong and here's why, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, right? But we've done a really good job of holding each other back and saying, just take that energy and focus it into building something. RubyMotion is approachable, right? I think that's what I wanted to point out with the array of windows from Xcode, right? Yes, Xcode is capable, but it's also a little daunting if you've never done iOS development before. So RubyMotion lets you sort of take an easy glide path into the iOS development world, but it still remains all of the functionality you would need to build a full-featured app. Rich Hickey once had this talk. It's a really good talk, actually, about how programming is like music performance, right? Nobody expects to play, you know, Beethoven's Fifth the first time they sit down at a piano. And yet so many programming communities try and say, in 5 minutes, you're going to create the next Facebook. Well, that's just not realistic, right? There's going to be years and years of practice and repetition and failure and mistakes and learning. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to sit down at the piano and create a tone the first time you hit a key, right? You don't have to string a piano every time you want to play it. So there is practice, there is time, but that first step should be doable. And finally, in reflecting on what makes RubyMotion different, I realized that even though the MacRuby project and then the RubyMotion project and the community surrounding it has been at it for almost 7 years now, we really don't know what we're doing. We're constantly surprised by the questions people ask. You know, for example, could you use Ruby gems with RubyMotion? I don't know. Maybe. Let's try it and find out. And the thing is that, you know, I think every community has that at the beginning. And that's how you get the first group of people in. But there's this tendency over time to have the right way to do it, the best practices. You know, this is the canonical implementation. And that can be a little off-putting for people that aren't there on day zero, right? I wrote this code and somebody told me, you're doing it wrong. There is a way that you can invite people in and guide them along a path of discovery so that they find those best practices on their own. But if you keep that open mind, you might find that maybe the best practices aren't the best. Maybe there's a different way to do it. And so finally, I think in trying to summarize all of these different points and what it is about the RubyMotion community that I love and that I think really makes it an enjoyable community to be a part of, I had to return to this. Right? This famous XKCD. I think in our daily lives, we have the programmers that we interact with. For most of you, that might be direct face-to-face interaction, right? And then there's everybody else, right? There's this dividing line of the internet, and all the people out on the internet are somehow different than the guy sitting in the cubicle next to you. But in reality, programmers are people too, right? So even that person on the mailing list or the forum or in the chat room, even though they might be wrong, they're probably more like you than you might be surprised just how much like you they are. So something to keep in mind. Thanks. I'd be happy to take any questions, but I will be not at all offended if you want to run for food.
So questions?
Hi. So thanks for showing us that. That looks really exciting. Just to go back to a couple of technical questions, sure. Or just the one. You mentioned that it's fully Cocoa Touch compatible. Can you also write Mac, OS 10 apps with RubyMotion?
Relatively recently, yes.
Okay.
So originally the idea was just iOS, but then as of like 6 months ago, I think, maybe even more recent than that, you can actually build OS 10 apps. And what's interesting is one of the big things that's missing from RubyMotion on iOS is eval. And that's not a technical limitation, that's a Apple terms and conditions limitation, right? You're not allowed to evaluate code on the device, right? OS 10 doesn't have that limitation, so if you write RubyMotion apps for OS 10, you can actually use eval. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. My other question is, does RubyMotion facilitate code signing, provisioning profiles, and all that?
It's all handled for you. In fact,
that's
what
amazing.
I didn't show...
That's the best thing I've heard. Thank you.
In fact, what I didn't show is that rake process, right? I mean, in sticking with the Ruby philosophy, everything is done through rake. So if you want to run it in the simulator, you just type rake, right? And that's the default action. If you want to run it on the device, you say rake device, and then it ships it over to whatever device is plugged in, and it runs it there. You can say rake device debug, and it actually runs it on the device in debug mode and gives you a REPL and a debug prompt so that you can actually step through the code running on the device. When you're done, you just say, I think it's rake release, and it actually signs it, packages all up, gives you the IPA, and you're ready to go off to iTunes Connect and start making money, right?
Thank you.
Who else? Oh. So in practice, do people generally start projects entirely in RubyMotion, or do you see some maybe larger or existing projects where pieces start to become RubyMotion, but the rest is Objective-C?
You know, it's interesting. This is one of those examples of learning as we go. Initially, it was sort of, well, you're going to use RubyMotion to make an app, right? But as RubyMotion grew, and the community grew, and people started asking questions like that, there were capabilities added to RubyMotion. So now You can take a pre-existing Objective-C app and you can start building, you can start rewriting classes in RubyMotion and generate a static library from the RubyMotion and link it back into your Objective-C. You can do the flip side too. You can have an Objective-C library that encapsulates some functionality or coordinates with some API, right? And you don't want to have to rewrite it in Ruby. Well, that's fine. You can just add it to your RubyMotion project, and RubyMotion will call Xcode to compile the Objective-C and then link it into your RubyMotion app. In fact, CocoaPods, right, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. It's essentially like Ruby gems, but for Objective-C. CocoaPods was written by Aloy, who was like the second person on the Mac Ruby project, and he works for HipByte now. And it was actually created because we wanted people to have an easy way to use Objective-C in RubyMotion. So you can use CocoaPods in RubyMotion. It's fully integrated. So you can do any kind of mixing and matching of Objective-C and RubyMotion that you want. And we've seen people go both ways. We've seen people take overly complicated UI code in Objective-C and rewrite it in RubyMotion so it's easier to change and to refactor. And we've seen people build RubyMotion apps and then realize that there are certain parts that need that extra bit of low-level C performance and rewrite certain classes in Objective-C.
So the common denominator seems to be that you have to have a stage where you have static libraries. You don't have like a compiler that compiles everything together in one app.
Well, the RubyMotion compiler will. So the RubyMotion compiler is just really a wrapper around Xcode. So you do still need to have Xcode installed. You just don't need to run it. Yeah, iOS is only static linking, except for like the core classes. So yeah, it's all statically compiled and then linked together, but it's all handled for you. You don't have to do that. When you run rake, if you have a CocoaPod, the rake command will see that you have the CocoaPod. It will compile the Objective-C as Objective-C. It will generate the static library, link it in, and compile the rest of the code, and again, package it all up for you. So it's optimized for developer happiness.